Well, thank you for joining me again, Professor Haggai Erlich. This is the second time you're joining me on Tagat, and I'm so happy that you have managed to find time to join us today.
My pleasure, Tigray. Good.
It's my pleasure, indeed. And a lot of people have said that they learned a lot from our previous interview. They loved the historical references you made, your presentation and everything. And following that interview, some people have reached out to me to say that I should try to have you on, which is why I wrote you to come on again. So I'm so happy that you have managed to do that today. And unlike our previous interview, Professor, today I thought we would zoom in on one aspect of Ethiopian history, namely on Alula. Our previous interview was more sort of broad sweep. We covered a lot of events, and today I thought we would focus on Alula. And the reason for that is I think some of the friction and divide and disagreements in Ethiopian and Eritrean politics today is because of differences in how people see historical events. And there is no bigger historical figure in Ethiopia than Alula. So I thought we would try to create some sort of understanding on Alula. And maybe we could start with you telling us about his humble origins. One of the things that I was struck by in your book was that he had an unconventional beginning, in the sense that he was born to not to the aristocracy, but to ordinary farmers, but somehow he made his way to the top. And maybe you could tell us that journey, Professor.
Yeah, it took me a while. We are talking about my experience 60 years ago. I'm testing my memory. The moment I was advised to study about Alula for my PhD thesis in London University, I started digging in the books. There were only a few lines here and there. And then I was puzzled, who were his parents? I had some clues from Italian journalists and so on, contemporary ones. At the end, I found myself in Ariadi, in Tembien, riding a jeep that belonged to the anti-malaria campaign at the time. The two grandchildren of Alula accompanied us, and we went to a village called Manawe, in which he was born. And I was told there that his father was named Ingeda. Could be. His mother is not really known. And he was a peasant in this village in Tembien. He did not belong to what we may call the aristocracy of Tigray. There were leading families in Tigray that you could follow back to the 16th century, establishing themselves in the various sub-districts of Tigray. And power in Tigray rotated between those families from Endarta, from Shire, from Adwa, and so on. But Alula was a very humble origin, and all his career, it was the aristocracy, so to speak, of Tigray didn't consider him a legitimate member of the elite. And fortunately or not fortunately for him, he was sent by Emperor Johannes to beyond the river Mareb to administer what would be Eritrea later, and lead the battles against the foreign invaders, the Egyptians, the Sudanese, the Italians, and there he made a name for himself. But all throughout his career, he was challenged by the, so to speak, aristocracy of Tigray because of his humble origin, and therefore he built his own base in Eritrea. He established, or really made the little town of Asmara his capital, and he really made his base, so to speak, in Eritrea.
And one of the things that I found really interesting reading your book, Professor, was that you say because of his humble beginnings in Tigray, he was never really accepted among the Tigrayan aristocracy, and because of that, he was always seen with a degree of suspicion in Tigray, and because of political matters that we might come back to later, he was seen with a degree of suspicion in Eritrea as well. Outside of Ethiopia, outside of Tigray in Ethiopia as well, he was never accepted. So he struck me as a man who didn't really have a base in Ethiopia, in the sense that he was seen with suspicion everywhere. But despite that, he managed to create a strong connection with Johannes. If you could expand a little bit on that connection he had with Johannes and how he managed the fact that he was really not trusted in Ethiopia and Eritrea.
He was fully loyal to Johannes. And Johannes in person was a very suspicious person. He suspected everyone, not without good reason. But he managed to build his power in Tigray in spite of the rivalry and jealousies all over the province. And Alula was first a minor functionary in his court. Then he trusted him with some military function, a Shalaka, a commander of 1,000, to be the leading guard against the invading Egyptians in 1875, 1876. And there he excelled and won the battle. Johannes entrusted him over what would be Eritrea, the Mareb Melash, beyond the river Mareb, which was at the time Hamasen, Saraya, Kele Guzai. The name Eritrea would be pronounced later by the Italians only in 1890, and we are talking the 1870s, that he was entrusted with this region that was challenged by the Egyptians, then the Sudanese and the Italians at the same time. That was the real frontier of Ethiopia. And there he proved himself as a tactician, as a loyal and full general, and a fully loyal to Johannes. Much to the jealousy of others in Tigray itself that were plotting and so on against Johannes, and also, of course, in Eritrea itself, because he kind of finished the power of the locals, notably Ras Alula from the last authentic leader of Eritrea prior to 1991, 1993. He finished the local autonomy of Hamasen, a story which is recycled time and again by Eritreans today as Alula, the treacherous person who and colonialists from Tigray. The story is really recycled, revisited by modern Eritreans today. Maybe we come to that later on. But he had to take care of his position in both what would be Eritrea and in Tigray. And the thing to remember all throughout that he was fully loyal to Johannes. And Johannes could trust him only in the last few months that Johannes summoned him to Tigray to fight the Mahdiya, and therefore Eritrea was abandoned and taken by the Italians, a very historical strategic mistake. Alula had to leave Asmara, and some of the locals, especially the cousin of Johannes, Debe Baraya, betrayed Asmara to the Italians. The Italians established Eritrea without firing even one shot. So the key element there is full loyalty to Johannes, and is building his power base in Eritrea. He was the first, if you want, in the language of the Eritreans today, first colonizer of Ethiopia in Eritrea, and there he built his own regime around Asmara. Yeah.
Well, we will indeed come to the issue of how Alula should be seen in Eritrea, because as I said in my email to you, one of the things that I want us to discuss today is what is the legacy of Alula in Eritrea, because that is one of the sort of sticky issues in relations between Tigray and Eritrea today. But in terms of, just to close the circle, in terms of the dynamic between Johannes and Alula, one of the fascinating things about the dynamic was that the trust and loyalty went both ways. Alula trusted Johannes, but also it seems to me, reading through your page, that Johannes trusted Alula as well, and Alula trusted Johannes as well. In Alula's interactions with British officials, for instance, or Egyptian officials, or Italian officials, it didn't seem to occur to him that he could plot against Johannes. And to give some idea to our listeners, this is a time when palace intrigue and plotting and usurping the games of the town. But it didn't seem to Alula that these are things that he should do. And I wonder why.
I was puzzled by that again. Also, the political on the political level is very clear. He had no power base in Tigray proper, which was the center of the empire at the time, only the favor of Johannes. And I was puzzled if there is something personal behind it. Alula was like 20 years younger than Johannes. If there was something very personal, maybe, I don't know. I tried to find out if there was something erotic there. Johannes was a very lonely person. He had one wife who had died before his coronation in 1871. She was from Afar, and then he remained a very lonely person, very sad person. He didn't have children. He kind of adopted, in the final moment, the children of his brother, Mangasha and Araya. And it seemed to me that he was Johannes, very depressed person. And there was something personal in the connection between them. And there was also something strategic, because Johannes was challenged inside Ethiopia not only by the Tigrayans themselves, the rivalry and so on. They were all grateful and obedient to Johannes, but Negus Menelik from Shoa and Negus Tekla Haymanot from Gojam, he had to go inside Ethiopia from time to time to preserve his crown, and then he would summon Alula from Asmara to help in the home front. So Alula met Johannes many times, and from what I found from the material, that Johannes trusted him, but Johannes, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but there was something paranoid about Johannes. And at times he did not fully trust. He entrusted the major front of his empire in the hands of Alula. And Alula was at times not careful enough from Johannes' point of view. That he was very militant, scored battles. Alula won at least 10 battles in this front of Eritrea, facing the enemies that I mentioned before. Alula was a very, very militant person. He won his way to power by proving himself as a general. and Johannes at times was angry at him, why he's so militant, why he's not more flexible with the Italians, especially, and the British, and so on. So there was some tension about that. Johannes had a broader vision of the whole empire and the need to have diplomacy better than Alula. Of course, the major story about that was the Battle of Dogali in January 1887, that Alula slaughtered an Italian battalion which started the countdown towards the demise of Yohannes and Tigray and so on. So there was some personal element in their special relations, trust and maybe some sympathy, mutual, but it became a very, very strategic story. The middle of history of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the relations between the two. As I mentioned before, at the end, Johannes was very angry at him for creating this situation with the Italians, and then he summoned him to fight the Mahdists in the West, where he died in the Battle of Metema in March 1889. So you're right, the relations, and there was a personal dimension there which I couldn't decipher fully between Johannes and Alula was very important, but there are things that you can only assume, but you don't know.
Indeed. Well, one thing that we know for sure, and it's very clear in your writing, is that Alula trusted, Johannes trusted Alula so much that he made him the ruler of Meremilash, what is today roughly, I think, the highlands of Eritrea. And of course, Alula today is seen in different ways in Eritrea. There are people, of course, who see him as a hero, but there are people who see him as a villain as well. And you do recount those changing sentiments. You had conversations with the leadership of the Eritrean liberation movement, and I think it boils down to what Eritreans believe Alula did in Eritrea, not least his interactions with Walter Michael. How do you think Alula should be seen in Eritrea?
He was the embodiment of the historical option of Eritrea being a part of Ethiopia, which of course is not the line followed by the modern Eritrean movement. And therefore most of Eritreans today don't like the historical figure of Ras Alula. And the historical memory goes back to episodes that can support the idea that Alula was a colonialist, was brutal, was treacherous. Around the story of Walter Michael, the last local ruler, so to speak, that Alula tricked him and sent him to Johannes, who put him in Debra Tabor, and Johannes put him on the Ambasalama for the next decade or so, ending what used to be kind of autonomy of the Mareb Melash and Hamasen. So it's remembered fully, and also some episodes that Alula was not a very perfect politician and person. Out of frustration, for instance, in 1886, and my memory is being challenged with age, when he was sent by Johannes and maneuvered by the British to go to Kassala in the Sudan, and he failed. He didn't want to go there. He wanted to keep an eye on Massawa and the Italians there. but it was strict maneuver to go there, and there was malaria there, and it was overly ambitious enterprise, and he failed there. And then I think that out of frustration, he massacred the people of the Baria and the Kunama, the tribes there in Western Eritrea that were supposed to supply him with cattle and water. And this slaughter, the massacre of the Baria and Kunama is remembered by Eritreans today. From their perspective, it was the brutal colonialist. And there are other related episodes that, but I want to emphasize the following. Alula wanted to modernize the Asmara power base of East. And his model for modernization, not out of enlightenment, but out of his ambition and understanding that he needs more power, he wanted to connect Asmara to Massawa, the trade from Massawa. Massawa was already a kind of Red Sea major port, and merchants from all over, Greeks and the Indians and what have you, were there. And it was at the time, roughly the time that Menelik established Addis Ababa in the south. Roughly speaking, I would say Alula wanted to do the same for Asmara. In Tigray itself, there was not much of urbanization. But Alula wanted to create an urban center based on the line with Massawa, and therefore he followed a very different policy towards the local Muslims, very much different from what Johannes led in Ethiopia itself. Johannes was kind of a crusader who, to put it mildly, maltreated the Muslims. But Alula cultivated the merchants and the caravans to Massawa. And out of the little village of Asmara, he built the beginning of what is today. Of course, later on, the Italians came and made it a little Rome. The Ras Alula Tukuls, on the hills of there, were his compound, and by Italian sources, there were some 10,000 soldiers, mostly from Tigray. They sort of colonized the land. Alula enacted them portions of land and so on, and enabled them to marry local ladies and so on. But out of this ambition to modernize the Marab Melash and make his own power base, he conducted a very kind of a modern policy. But of course, on the line, when the Italians came, they started intervening in this game, protecting the Muslim tribes in the periphery, which Alula used to raid and tax. The Habab, the Asauta, the Atakla, and others, and they were wavering between the Mahadist option of radical Islam that was radiating from Kassala and Osman Digna and that, and the Italians promised to protect them, and the fear of Alula's might that wanted to mobilize them for the modernization of the Marab Melash province, Hamasen, Saraya, Keleguzai, and so on. So in this complicated story, there came also the element of internal Ethiopian jealousies. I just mentioned the Dabab Araya, who found his base in the Asauta tribe nearby Massawa and collaborated with Italians, and then promised allegiance to Yohannes, and Johannes thought that he would help him, and there went the story of Johannes entrusting Asmara to Debe Baile Maria. Debe Baile Maria was later commander of the division. Debe Baraya, and summoned Alula to go with him to fight, to face Menelik in the south, and then the Darbush, the Sudanese in Metemma, he died. So the own personal story of Alula, his ambition and so on, was, if you want, the beginning of the modern story of today's Eritrea. And many Eritreans remember Ras Alula as, not without justice, as a kind of Ethiopian colonialist. If you identify with Eritrea and the Eritrean modern movement, and you go back to history, then Alula is the villain. He is the Ethiopian colonialist. And if you want to smear him, you can find episodes like we mentioned along his personal story. But to me, I try all the time, whenever I deal with history, to remain somewhat detached. I warned myself when I did my doctorate back in London, time and again, look, you are not the advocate, you are not the lawyer of Ras Alula. You have to be objective. And when I found that Alula was not a very nice person, he divorced his wife to marry a younger one because she was connected to the aristocracy, and alienated his daughters. Alula was far from a perfect person, but his story is really the beginning of modern Eritrean history, and the option of connecting it to Ethiopia. It just comes to my mind to compare him to Haile Selassie, that in 1952 and then fully in 1962 re-annexed fully Eritrea to Ethiopia and imposes imperial biblical regime on the Eritrean society. So you can, if you want, from the Eritrean point of view, the first villain was, I mean, if you identify with the idea that retroactively, like every nationalist movement, goes back to the past and find the roots. If they were there or not, that's a different story. Today's Eritreans go back to Eritrea like in the continuation of the Aksumite Empire. Of course, there were those who contended that Eritrea is part of the Islamic Arab world, like Osman Saleh Sabi and so on. But those who want the battle for the historical soul of Eritrea, the EPLF, Isaias and so on, for them Eritrea was always Eritrea, not Muslim, Arab, not Ethiopian, Eritrea. And from this perspective, Alula was the historical villain. By the way, I found out, I revisited the whole story lately. I wrote a book, it's in Hebrew, Eritrea Down the Road of History. Going all throughout from the ancient beginnings of this region to today. Unfortunately, the title of the book is Down the Road of History. But the figure of Isaias Afewerki enhanced the historical story of Ras Michael. And Mele Zenawi adopted the historical figure of Ras Alula. And in between them, a very complicated story. I don't know if you want to go into that, but for them, it was like a 1990s, 1980s.
I think we might go in a bit of detail into that because the TPLF, of course, sort of consciously decided to make Alula their sort of I wouldn't say role model, but inspiration, or at least they wanted to weave the Tigray story around him, and the Eritreans decided to weave their national story around Walde Michael. And I think some of our viewers might wonder why is it that the Eritreans thought Walde Michael was probably a better vehicle for their national story than Alula, and why the Tigrayans decided to stick with Alula, although maybe that is something kind of straightforward.
Well, Walter Michael was a native of Tzazega, and the family that one of the families, Tzazega and Hazega, dominated Hamasen, which is the heart of Melash, of future Eritrea. And he was like the authentic figure of what would be Eritrea in the future. No wonder that every nationalist movement, looking back to the past and looking for justification for its future ambitions, that the Eritreans adopted Ras Michael and the story of his deprivation from power by the treacher Ras Alula and so on. It fitted very well into the narrative, and in today's Eritrea, Ras Michael was like one of the father figures of Eritrea, not for the Muslims, but for the Christians. TPLF adopted Alula. What can be more natural for them than the one who defended the country, the one who was victorious, the son of a peasant like them themselves, the TPLF, the pride of Tigray, and so on. I told the story time and again. I came to Ethiopia in September 1991. And now he sort of indirectly invited, and he told me that they had one copy of my book on Ras Alula, and Meles divided it into certain chapters and gave it to commanders of the TPLF who were still in the field at the time to read. And at night around the bonfire, they used to speak and so on. Meles joked with me that he was the one who read from chapter 1 to chapter 13 in sequence, but all the others were given, and he used to teach them about it. In 1995, I came to Asmara to talk about Alula. And there was all the leaders of the EPLF, not Isaias. I was told that he is listening from a different room. And I talked about Alula, and then the foreign minister, I forgot his name, summoned me to coffee, and he said, "You remember the monument for Alula that Mengistu erected in Dogali, where there was the victory of the Italians in 1887? And he boasted, I myself blasted it with a bazooka." So every nationalist movement, every person needs an interpretation of history to mobilize a myth and imagine a story. I understand that this is the way things go, every nationalist movement, ignoring the others, inflating its own past and so on. But I try to remain, luckily for myself, I must say, to remain loyal to my profession as an historian. Not to advocate that, but to reconstruct the complexity of the past, and of course apply my ideas, my judgment also, but be aware of that this is the profession. I admit that I have my bias. By the way, I wrote a Hebrew book. My life with Ethiopia and Ishmael, the Middle East.
Mm.
And I admit there that in the previous years, I developed a sort of frustration and anger. With the Arabs, we speak about sometimes, other times. But I was driven to study Ethiopia in the early 1970s, still in the Haile Selassie's period. And I spent 6 months in Ethiopia, including Asmara and Tigray and so on. But that was a period of hope. Haile Selassie is aging, it will be over, and then we shall develop a democracy. I spent many times in Addis Ababa campus with all the professors and young students. They were all full of hope. The future is ours. We shall develop a very advanced republic, maybe some monarchical elements, but it will be modern Ethiopia. At the same time, the Eritreans in exile, they were having a ball in Western capitals. The EPLF was a great promise for the model of a liberation front from Imperial Ethiopia, later of Mengistu's brutal Ethiopia, that they will develop liberation of peasants, liberation of women. They were there in London and in other capitals, and in Washington and elsewhere. They were the darling of the intelligentsia, the EPLF. And I myself also, without having any share in political activity, but I was very much hopeful that Eritrea, modern Eritrea, the liberation fronts and all that will be a model for the modernization of the whole of Horn of Africa, which in a way would happen because the model of the liberation front was adopted by the Tigrayans, the Oromos and others. But as an outsider, I was also disillusioned. I had once Eritrean Italian, I wouldn't mention his name, that asked me, shall I return to Eritrea or stay in Italy? And I gave him a quote unquote, a very Zionist speech. You have to go back to your country and help developing it. So this poor fellow went to Eritrea and then later on fled back to Italy. He forgave me for the advice.
Well, I think you make a lot of fascinating points, but just to pick up on one of them, you make the interesting point that political parties today, and I think this applies to people in general, tend to reconstruct aspects of history that they think are convenient for their politics today. And I think one of the things that many people in Tigray find curious in relation to the TPLF is that the TPLF, they are happy to be associated with Alula for the reasons that you explained, but they want to maintain a degree of distance from Johannes. And I'm talking about the TPLF in Tigray. And many people, Tigrayans, find that well, there are people who find it offensive because he's a pivotal historical figure, and for the ruling party of Tigray to openly not want to be associated with Johannes is, to some people, an act of betrayal in a way. I'm just making a general observation in terms of that. But I think maybe the broader point in relation to Ethiopia and Tigray and Eritrea is that for Alula, my impression is that reading your book, my impression is that there wasn't any distinction for him between, say, Adigrat or Adwa and Aksum or the places in Eritrea that he was ruling. For him, they were all Tigrayan territories, and everything that he did in Eritrea, he could have done in Tigray if the situation had demanded it. So in that respect, I find some of the sentiments that my Eritrean brothers and sisters express in terms of saying Alula was a colonialist, when they know that everything he did in Eritrea he could have done in Tigray, and for him it didn't make any difference between Tigray and Eritrea. I don't know if you'd like, maybe I'm trying to force you to make something that is convenient for my today's politics. Maybe it's not fair on my part. But if you'd like to reflect on that, on the fact that for them, for Wolde Michael and for Alula, there wasn't any distinction between Eritrea and Ethiopia and Tigray. But for today's Eritreans and Tigrayans, the reality has changed completely.
Well, you mentioned many points. Let me pick on one or two of them. Alula could do what he wanted to do and did in Mareb Melash, in future Eritrea. But in Tigray itself, he was fully dependent on Yohannes. And once Yohannes was killed, the only thing he could do is to clinch to Ras Mangasha, the adopted son of Yohannes, and through him to try to preserve Tigrayan independence from Menelik from 1889 to 1894. He himself was not had little power, but to the contrary, had no power in Tigray itself. But he was sort of forcing Ras Mangasha to keep Tigray going against Menelik, against the Italians, and so on. Very complicated story. Let me go to the point of the TPLF adopting Alula and not Yohannes. The TPLF itself was the first revolution in Tigray's history. I mentioned before, the aristocracy of Tigray. You can go back to the 16th century to see the leading families of the various sub-regions of Tigray establishing themselves, acquiring firearms and redistributing land and so on, and creating the dynasties of the different regions, which Johannes managed to unite for a while.
And maybe a slight departure.
Sorry. The first revolution against the leading elite of Tigray, this leading elite, beginning the 16th century, was re-adopted by Haile Selassie. Until 1974, the leading families, Ras and Ras Guksa and all the rest of them, they remained the administrators. The only region that Haile Selassie understood that it had some autonomy in that respect, that the leading families would remain, or the only province of Ethiopia was the old elite. The TPLF was internal Tigrayan revolution. The sons of peasants or local functionaries and so on, in 1975, fleeing from Addis Ababa, from the campus back to Tigray, and capturing the leadership of Tigray. And it was very natural that they will identify with Alula, the son of a peasant, and not with Johannes, the one who dominated the aristocracy, the old aristocracy of Tigray. There was a year of 3 revolutions at the same time, not a year. 1974, next 2-3 years, the Derg in Addis Ababa, the TPLF in Tigray, and the EPLF beginning to dominate the Eritrean movement until it got rid of the ELF later on. There were 3 internal revolutions. The one in Tigray saw Alula naturally as the one who inspired them. Johannes would not inspire them. He was kind of royalty. And the one in Eritrea, led by EPLF, Isaias, had to choose between, at the time, mid-70s, there was still the Islamic Arab option embodied by the ELF, and the ideology of Arab unity and so on. And there was still the option of rejoining Ethiopia. The Unity Party, the Unionist Party, it was during was still the idea of rejoining Ethiopia and then there was the idea of Eritrea for native Eritreans, led by the EPLF and Isaias, and that's the option that won. But it was quite revolutionary at the time. The major trends of belonging to the Arab Middle East or belonging to Ethiopia, the thesis that won was no, Eritrea for Eritreans. So it naturally went to Ras Alula Michael and rethinking history in retrospect along those lines.
Well, we're going to make a jump because we don't have time. I say a jump because Alula and Johannes were dealing with the British in Massawa, and then the British left and the Italians came, and it got a little bit more tricky and difficult for Alula to deal with the Italians. I think for reasons we don't have time to go into, it was easier for them to deal with the British. I think there was a degree of trust, and then the Dogo Ali happened, and then Alula died, And there is a passage in your book where you describe Alula's attempt at uniting the North, Eritrea and Tigray, to challenge the South, namely Menelik. And you say that he failed, obviously, as everybody knows. And there are a lot of things in the book that you describe that are very reminiscent of Tigrayan politics today, in terms of factionalism and sabotaging and things like that. And if you could tell us a little bit why was it difficult for the other people like Mengesha and I forgot the others like Siyum, to appreciate the danger from the south and to unite and unite Eritrea and Tigray and challenge the south, because it didn't seem to me that they understood. It was only Alula who seemed to have understood the enormity of the challenge.
Well, that was you remind me, it was an episode in 1892, if I'm not mistaken. Eritrea was already established as Eritrea, Italian Eritrea. Ruler was Gandolfi. Italians were intervening all the time in Tigrayan affairs and Shoan affairs and so on. Alula, out of Tigrayan pride, opted for a while to consider joining the Italians in Eritrea. And he kind of forced Ras Mangasha to join him, to cross the Mareb and make a sort of a dialogue with Gandolfi. Mangasha enacted Gandolfi the title of Ras. It was considered a joke, but it was not, because if you entitle someone with the title of Ras, it means that you are an Agus. But the Italians didn't understand it. In any case, it's just a side episode. The Tigrayans, they were just the dominant factor in the Horn of Africa. They were the ones who spilled their blood, defending Ethiopia, scoring victories all over, from their point of view. At the same time, the Shoans under Menelik were trading with the Italians, acquiring power, conquering the south. So we shall succumb to them. They were caught in between the Italians in Eritrea and the Shoans, Menelik, the mighty Menelik in the south, and in the process later leading to their submitting to Johannes, to Menelik in 1894. By the way, they took Ras Alula with them. There were 4 Tigrayans who came June 1894, if I'm not wrong, to Addis Ababa to submit to Menelik. It was Mangasha, Alula, Ras Agos, if I'm not mistaken, and Ras Alula. He was freed from Amba Salama and came there as representing Tigray in uniting against the Italians. So it was a very complicated story, but it was clear that Menelik and Shoa were the more powerful element. They were already enriched by the conquest in the south, and Tigray was totally destroyed, starving, lacking even basic ammunition. They had enough rifles to resist, but not bullets. That was the tragedy of Tigray, being stuck between Eritrea and the heartland of Addis Ababa, the capital of the whole of Ethiopia, modernizing under Menelik, and in the end, Menelik proved, and his general Ras Mekonnen, the father of Haile Selassie, managing to defeat the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in March 1896. And ever since then, Tigray became just a province of Ethiopia. But Menelik himself, and then, as I mentioned before, Haile Selassie, understood that the pride of Tigray should not be overly humiliated. You have to leave the local families in control. Ras Mekonnen came to Mekelle was appointed by Menelik to be the administrator of Tigray, but after 2 months he wrote to Menelik, "It's impossible, I am going back to the south." And that's the story until today. The story of today, the war in Tigray, it goes back to centuries of Tigrayan pride and sort of tragedy being stuck between the Europeans in Eritrea and the Shoan, so to speak, from Tigrayan point of view in the south. But this spirit that our Ras Alula is the embodiment of it, of Tigrayan might, Tigrayan pride, humiliated by the powers behind it, and from their point of view, sacrificing themselves to defend Ethiopia. I mean, you can understand the argument that we Tigrayans shed our blood to defend in the north against the Italians, against the Mahdiya, against the Egyptians first, while the Shoans, they had the ball in the south, conquering and annexing and then depriving us. That's the story that is feeding Tigrayan pride until today.
So what that? Yes, I mean, I was going to say that tragedy of Tigrayans being unable to choose between the north and the south. It seems to be a perennial problem, and actually, in my probably pathetic attempt to understand why that is, I was reading a book by Tim Marshall. He tries to explain political decisions using geography. I think you will know him. And I was wondering, maybe if it is the geography of Tigray, that means that Tigrayans couldn't quite make up their mind about that, whether to go north or south, because the exact same problem that Alula was wrestling with after Johannes died are the problem that Tigrayan politicians today are wrestling with. And I don't know how much of Tigray politics you follow today, and I'm not trying to invite you to make commentary on current politics, but there is a split in Tigray now. And essentially the essence of the split is with some people saying that we should go north, our allegiance should be to Eritrea, and the other half saying we should go south. So the personalities change, the circumstances change, but the basic question that Tigrayans don't seem to have a solution for seems to be to find that how do you deal with that dilemma with south or north? And I wonder what you would make, what observations or comments you might have as a historian about that.
Well, you're absolutely right. The Tigrayans are stuck in the middle. Tigray was the cradle of Ethiopia, the Aksumite Empire, which prospered as long as it was connected to the Red Sea. There was the port of Adulis, and later on Massawa, and as long as Aksum was connected to the sea, the Bahar Negus, Bahar Meder, and all that, to the land which is the Eritrea of today. Greater Tigray, including the Tigrayan speakers, including Eritrea and the Red Sea orientation and so on, that is the option, quote unquote, of keeping Tigray as a living entity. The other option is, of course, be a part of Eritrea centered on the south. So I understand the Tigrayans wavering between the two options that you mentioned. I don't know what the future holds, but maybe we shall live long to see Tigray and Eritrea reunited to create a Tigrayan entity. There is some logic into that. Or Eritrea joining the greater Horn of Africa, decentralized around so to speak, ethnic entities. I don't know what the future holds. everything that will develop in the future has its roots in the past. Historians should reconnect future developments to their historical roots, but should not be twisted by the ever-developing prism. The figure of Alula that we discussed today, we have to see it against its time, and the figure against his weaknesses as a person and strength as a person.
Well, we have run out of time, Professor, but if you could stay for two more questions, I'm being unfair to you now, because you mentioned that things should be seen in against the background of their time. And one of the sensitive issues in Tigray is conversation about how Alula and Johannes dealt Muslims, for instance. There is a sense and understanding that they were unfair to Muslims, and one could say that by the standards of the time, that was what they were supposed to do, or maybe one could say that they were indeed unfair, and Tigrayan Muslims today have a reason to feel aggrieved when Tigrayans in general talk about Yohannes and Alula in completely positive terms. I wonder if you could reflect on that. And the second question is, I asked you about what Alula's legacy should be in Tigray and in Eritrea, but also I would love if you could reflect on how he should be seen in Ethiopia. And there was a passage in your book, there's a passage in your book that made me smile a little bit, because I didn't expect that. You say that Mengistu actually idealized him in some sense, Alula, although not in all senses. And that was interesting to me, because generally in Ethiopia today, I don't think Alula is seen in, or Johannes for that matter, seen in any positive light. I think there is a dismissive tendency among Ethiopians to those two giant Tigrayan historical figures. So if you could reflect on those two things, we're going to end with that, Professor.
Because the Muslims in Tigray and the Muslims all around the world, for them Johannes was the great crusader that forced Muslims to convert to Christianity by sword, and that's very much true historically. But we have to understand, for Johannes, the great threat to Christian Ethiopia in his eyes was the encirclement by Muslims outside and inside, and for him to, Johannes never sort of really controlling the whole of Ethiopia politically, administratively, but spiritually in his Christian mind, to unite the church as the soul of Ethiopia. That's what he did in 1882. And he had sort of course, the main threat was the Sudanese Mahdiya, which was a very radical jihadist movement. So against the spirit of his time and his beliefs, his Christianity of his time, you can understand why he maltreated the Muslims. Look, everything has to be reinterpreted. Today, if you look back to the greater Ethiopia that Menelik created by conquering and annexing all the south of today's Ethiopia. So one may say he was joining the colonial scramble for Africa and joining the Christian powers of Europe, and they divided Africa between themselves, and this Menelik, armed by the Eritreans, conquering the Muslims of the south, which is also true. But at the same time, there is the counter argument that whatever was not annexed by Ethiopia, by Menelik, was conquered by the European imperialists. So it was a sort of an African defense movement by annexing, say, Harar and Sidama and all the rest to the great independent African state. So you can take the same story and give it this interpretation or this interpretation. What I'm happy to do is just to build a story and be true to professionalism. I search quite a number of historical cases. I try to avoid reaching today's point and make a judgment about the future. Whenever I did so, I was wrong, or half of it. But I find it very, very important to serve within limits the objectivity of historical cases, the complexity of it. So that's what I feel today. By the way, just to close the story, in the last 6 months, I returned to my MA thesis 58 years ago in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was on the tribes of Yemen. And I write now, Yemen from the Queen of Sheba to the Houthis. and again, it's...
You have interesting titles, I must say.
When I dealt with Yemen for my MA degree in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the late 60s, I never came across the name of Houthis. It was a family in the tribe of Hamdan in northern Yemen. And today's Houthis are conducting a full revolution. They adopted the kind of Shiism of the Iranians, not the pragmatical Shiism of historical Yemen. They get out of the mountainous citadel of Ethiopia and venture into the Red Sea. I wrote a book about the Red Sea, history of the Red Sea. I hardly mentioned Yemen, but today they intervene there in global affairs. But also, the Houthis, they reconstruct the tribal domination of Yemeni politics. So things are complex.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. Earlier, you said that your memory is being challenged by age. I think you have the photogenic memory and very sharp memory. I'm considerably younger than you, and I can't imagine being able to recall numbers and years from memory like you do. And actually, if I may say so, one of the things that people pointed out in our previous interview was your ability to recall factors from memory. So no doubt, no worries there. And thank you for writing those wonderful books on Alula and on Ethiopian history as well. I love the way you, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be too flattering to you, but I love the way you write. I think you have a colorful and lucid way of writing that is very engaging, and thank you very much. And I hope you're going to make time, another time, maybe more times actually, to come on and educate us on Ethiopian history. I believe understanding of history is a foundation for healthy politics as well. And as you know, Ethiopian politics is anything but healthy today. And I think more and more people need to be educated on history, including me. And I reach to you when I feel like people need a bit of education on history. But thank you very much for today, Professor.
My pleasure, Teklai. Next time. See you.